People called Isaac Merritt the junk mechanic because he fixed what everyone else threw away. Broken down trucks with cracked blocks, engines with stripped threads and seized pistons that proper shops turned away at the door. He brought them back to life inside a battered garage at the edge of Harlow, Texas. 6 years ago, Isaac sat in the glass-walled boardroom of the largest aerospace corporation in the country and told them their propulsion system would kill someone. They fired him that same afternoon. He packed one box, drove 6 hours south, and never looked back. Then one Tuesday morning in September, 3 black SUVs with no standard plates pulled up in front of his shop, and the woman who stepped out of the middle vehicle wore a gray suit, carried a thick classified folder, and looked Isaac directly in the eyes as though she had already memorized his face. What they needed existed nowhere in any laboratory in the world. It was sitting inside Isaac Merritt's garage, and the clock was already running. The town of Harlow woke up slow on most mornings. The gas station on Route 12 opened at 6. The diner on Calhoun Street began pouring coffee at 6:30. And by 7, Isaac Merritt was already flat on his back beneath the undercarriage of a 1995 Ford F-150 that belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Raymond, who could not afford the quote from Harlow Premier Auto across the street. The garage smelled like oil and rubber and something faintly metallic that had soaked into the concrete floor over 3 decades. His father had built the place with salvaged steel beams and second-hand lumber, and Isaac had never changed the layout. Tools hung on the wall in an order that looked random to everyone else and was perfectly logical to him. There were no employees, no apprentices, no front desk. Just Isaac and a transistor radio propped on a shelf above the parts bin, playing a jazz station out of San Antonio at a volume low enough not to disturb his concentration. His customers were the ones the big shops turned away. Old pickups with rust along the frame, delivery vans with transmissions that slipped between second and third, farm equipment with hydraulic lines cracked from years of summer heat. Isaac never quoted a price up front. He fixed things first and told the owner what it cost when they came to collect. The numbers were always lower than expected. Dale Hutchins, who owned Harlow Premier next door, had made a habit over the years of wandering to the fence line between the 2 properties and delivering some version of the same observation. Today it was delivered to a crew of 3 employees in matching blue shirts who laughed on cue. Merritt working on Raymond's old death trap again, Dale said loudly enough to carry across the lot. Man spends more time under garbage than a raccoon. Isaac heard it clearly. He tightened a bolt another quarter turn and said nothing. He had never once answered Dale Hutchins, and he did not intend to start. He had finished the exhaust manifold on Raymond's truck and was wiping down the block when he heard the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. Not the sound of a single vehicle, but of several arriving together, slowing precisely, stopping in a coordinated line. He set down the rag and rolled out from under the frame. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans sat in a row across the entrance of his lot, their engines idling. The windows were tinted past the legal limit for civilian plates, and there were no plates at all on the rear bumpers. Just clean steel. A door opened on the middle vehicle, and a woman stepped down onto the gravel in low heels that sank slightly into the soft shoulder of the unpaved lot. She was somewhere in her early 40s, with dark hair cut close to her jaw and the posture of someone who had spent years walking into rooms where she was not entirely welcome. She crossed the lot without hesitation and held out a credentials wallet. Isaac looked at it without taking it. The seal on the card was a blue globe with an orbital arc through it, and the name printed beneath the photograph read Eleanor Voss, Director of Systems Engineering, NASA Office of Launch and Orbital Programs. "Mr. Merritt," she said, "I need about 10 minutes of your time." Isaac looked past her at the 2 other vehicles whose doors had not opened. "You brought an escort for 10 minutes. "I brought colleagues who are also engineers," she said. "They're waiting because I asked them to." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. He leaned against the front fender of Raymond's truck and crossed his arms. "I signed a non-disclosure agreement 6 years ago," he said. "Anything involving Nexora Aerospace is off the table." "That agreement covers proprietary commercial information," Eleanor said. "It does not apply when the subject matter constitutes a national security concern." She reached under her arm and placed a thick manila folder on the hood of the truck between them. "I'm not here about Nexora. I'm here about a satellite called OBS-DN7, and I think you already know what's wrong with it, because you told them what would go wrong 6 years before we launched it." Isaac did not move. His eyes stayed on her face. He said nothing for a long moment, and then he looked down at the folder. "Leave it there," he said. "I'll look at it when I'm ready." He walked to the far end of the garage, poured himself a mug of coffee from a machine that had been running since 5 in the morning, and stood with his back to her for a full minute. When he turned around, she was still standing exactly where he had left her, not checking her phone, not shifting her weight. He walked back to the truck and opened the folder. The first page was a telemetry printout, pressure readings from a propulsion subsystem logging intervals at 93 minutes. The numbers were arranged in columns. Isaac looked at the first column for approximately 4 seconds, then looked at the second, and then looked at Eleanor Voss. He sat down on a metal stool that was missing one rubber foot. He looked at the third page, then the fourth. He had not intended to sit down, and he was not entirely certain when he had made the decision to do so. The numbers had made the decision for him, because they were not random degradation. They were a pattern, and it was the exact pattern he had described in a report that someone had buried in a classified archive without reading it to the end. He looked up from the folder. How long? Eleanor did not hesitate. 31 days from this morning. After that, the attitude control system loses authority over the orbital correction burn sequence, and the vehicle begins an uncontrolled descent. Isaac set the folder on the hood. Where is the satellite now? 240 miles above the Indian Ocean in a polar orbit. Controlled descent is not currently an option. She paused. The report you wrote in 2017 described a cumulative error tolerance failure in the secondary pressure regulation valve under sustained subthermal cycling. Every engineer at Nexora who saw that report was told to disregard it. I found a copy in a classified records archive 3 weeks ago. Then you know what the problem is. I know what the problem is, Eleanor said. I do not yet know how to fix it in 31 days without tearing apart a valve assembly that is currently in low Earth orbit. That is why I am standing in your parking lot in Harlow, Texas. Isaac was quiet for another moment. He looked at the gravel between his boots. Then he looked up. Let me finish what I'm working on, he said. Come back in 2 hours. 6 years earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 2017, Isaac Merritt had stood at the head of a conference table on the 12th floor of the Nexora Aerospace headquarters in Houston and explained in measured, methodical terms why the Prometheus drive propulsion assembly was going to fail. He was 38 years old at the time, a senior propulsion systems engineer with 12 patents to his name and a professional reputation that had taken a decade and a half to build. The room held 11 people. Cameron Ashford sat at the far end of the table. Head of Engineering, Cameron's title was Vice President of Technical Programs, flanked by 2 program managers and a legal representative whose presence Isaac had not expected and did not find encouraging. Giselle Hartman, the chief executive, sat to the right of Cameron with her hands folded on the table and an expression that Isaac had come to read over 3 years as professional patience deployed in the service of having already made up her mind. Isaac's presentation was 47 slides. He had prepared it over 6 weeks, running the thermal cycling models 4 separate times to confirm the output. The secondary pressure regulation valve in the third-stage drive assembly carried a design tolerance of plus or minus 0.004% across its rated temperature band. Under standard laboratory conditions, the assembly tested cleanly. But the operational temperature profile of a polar orbit satellite, which spent portions of every 93-minute orbital cycle transiting from full solar exposure to deep shadow and back, created a cumulative thermal oscillation pattern that fell outside the rated band. Not by much. But propulsion engineering was a discipline where not by much was the distance between a functioning satellite and a debris field. Isaac had modeled the failure cascade. The valve would begin degrading between month 18 and month 24 of the mission. By month 28, the drive assembly would lose pressure authority. The satellite would go dark. He had asked for 4 additional months to redesign the valve assembly to the correct tolerance. The contract with the Department of Defense required first hardware delivery in 11 months. Cameron Ashford looked at the slide showing Isaac's failure projection, glanced at Giselle Hartman, and then looked back at Isaac with an expression of controlled patience that Isaac recognized as the professional mask for something harder. Your model parameters are outside the validated range for this class of vehicle, Cameron said. The testing data we submitted to the customer does not support this failure scenario. Isaac had explained, again, that the testing data was generated at a cycling frequency that did not replicate orbital reality. Cameron had said the testing data was what the customer had accepted. Isaac had said the customer had accepted it because they had not been given the correct model. There was silence. Giselle Hartman looked at her folded hands. Isaac declined to sign the design approval. 2 weeks later, he received a termination letter citing a violation of internal security protocols, a charge vague enough to be unfalsifiable and precise enough to close every door in the industry. He was 38 years old with 12 patents and a reputation that was now attached to a disciplinary dismissal. He signed the non-disclosure agreement, took the settlement, and drove south. He had never checked to see whether the failure had happened. He told himself it was because he had moved on. He knew, in the quieter parts of the night, that it was because he was not sure he could survive knowing. Eleanor Voss had not been looking for Isaac Merritt. She had been looking for the source of a telemetry anomaly that none of her analysts could explain, and the source had led her to him. The OBSDN-7 satellite had been performing nominally for 21 months when the pressure readings began showing irregular deviation in the propulsion subsystem logs. The deviations were small, within the boundary of what a program manager might attribute to sensor drift. But Eleanor had spent 17 years in launch systems engineering, and she did not attribute anomalies to sensor drift until she had exhausted every other explanation. She pulled the full telemetry logs for the prior 60 days and gave them to her 3 best data analysts with no hypothesis attached, asking them to find the pattern. They found it in 10 days. The pressure deviation was cyclic. It repeated at intervals of exactly 93 minutes. That was not sensor drift. 93 minutes was the orbital period of OBSDN-7, and a deviation that correlated with orbital cycle was a deviation caused by something happening to the vehicle every time it passed through a specific environmental transition. Eleanor had pulled the original design documentation for the Prometheus drive assembly, worked through the thermal cycling specs, and found, buried in a classified records archive under a filing category that most analysts would never have reason to open, a report authored by an engineer named Isaac R. Merritt, dated March 14, 2017, predicting exactly the failure mode she was now watching unfold in the live telemetry. She had called Cameron Ashford that same morning, because Cameron was now a senior technical advisor to NASA under a consulting arrangement that Nexora had negotiated 18 months prior. Cameron had been unhesitating. That report was the work of a terminated employee who had performance issues, he said. The methodology was not validated by any other member of the engineering team. Eleanor had noted that the report appeared technically rigorous. Cameron had noted that Isaac had been dismissed for cause and that his analysis had not passed internal review. Eleanor had thanked him for his time and ended the call. Then she had looked up Isaac Merritt's current address in the professional licensing database and found a garage in Harlow, Texas. The failure timeline, as her team had modeled it that afternoon, gave her 32 days before the attitude control system lost the authority margin needed to maintain controlled orbital operation. After that, the vehicle would begin a descent that NASA's current contingency protocols had no clean solution for. She booked a flight to San Antonio the next morning. Isaac came back into the garage at midday. Eleanor was sitting on a wooden step stool she had found near the wall, reviewing something on a secure tablet. The 2 vehicles outside had not moved. She stood when he came in. Isaac looked at the folder still open on the truck's hood where he had left it, and then looked at her. "The 93-minute cycle," he said. "Your analyst flagged it?" "One of them flagged it," Eleanor said. "None of them could explain it." "It's resonant vibration," Isaac said. "Not thermal alone. The thermal oscillation from orbital shadow transit excites the valve housing at a frequency that matches the assembly's mechanical resonance band. Your design team modeled the thermal stress correctly and the vibration stress correctly, separately. Nobody combined the 2 transfer functions in the same model because they were managed by different engineering groups who didn't cross-reference. The valve doesn't fail from heat. It fails because it's vibrating itself apart at a frequency that only appears in combination. He said it the way a person describes something they have been holding in their head for 6 years and are finally permitted to release. I didn't have enough orbital data to quantify the resonance component when I wrote the report. I had the thermal model and a projected vibration band, but the numbers weren't tight enough to force a conclusion. Now you have 21 months of live data, and if I'm right, the resonance peak will show up as a secondary harmonic in the pressure oscillation at exactly 1/3 of the primary cycle period. Eleanor was already pulling data on her tablet. She scrolled for a moment. 31-minute secondary harmonic, she said quietly. It's there. I didn't recognize it as a harmonic subcomponent. I thought it was instrument noise. Isaac nodded. It's not instrument noise. Cameron Ashford arrived in Harlow the following morning without prior notice. He drove himself in a rental car, which Eleanor later noted was not typical of how Cameron moved when he was traveling in any official capacity. He walked into the garage at 9:40 and looked around with the measured expression of a man performing a careful emotional calculation before speaking. Isaac was at the workbench, not working on Raymond's truck, but sketching something on paper with a mechanical pencil. Cameron stood in the entrance and said good morning. Isaac acknowledged it. Cameron said he was in the area and had thought it would be helpful to speak directly, which was not a statement either of them believed. He said the situation with OBS Ident 7 was being handled through proper NASA protocols, that his team at Nexora was already developing a software remediation package, and that he wanted Isaac to understand the full context before drawing any conclusions. Isaac asked what full context he had in mind. Cameron said the report Isaac had written in 2017 had been reviewed by multiple engineers at the time, and that the failure mode it described had not been validated by peer assessment. Isaac said he was aware of that. Cameron said he hoped Isaac understood that any analysis he contributed in the current situation would need to be properly reviewed and could not replace the formal engineering process. Isaac looked at Cameron for a moment and said, "You should talk to Eleanor." Cameron's expression changed slightly. Not enough to be called a reaction, but enough that Isaac noticed it. He left a few minutes later. As he walked back to the rental car, he made a phone call. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. The only words that were audible at the far end of the line, where Giselle Hartman answered on the second ring, were Cameron's voice saying, "We have a problem." Eleanor arrived an hour after Cameron left. She came in, set her laptop bag on the workbench, and told Isaac that NASA's Oversight Board had formally authorized his temporary technical consultancy pending a clearance review. She also told him that Cameron had submitted a memo to the board the previous evening recommending that Isaac's involvement be suspended pending legal review of the non-disclosure agreement's applicability. "How much time did that memo cost us?" Isaac asked. "About 12 hours, Eleanor said. The board decided the national security exception language was sufficient. She looked at the papers scattered across the workbench. "What is that?" Isaac laid out 5 sheets of paper covered edge to edge in handwritten calculations. "The resonance model," he said. "The complete one. I've been running it since 2 in the morning." She looked at the sheets for a long moment. "You did this by hand." "I don't have the software licenses anymore." Eleanor stared at the calculations. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a satellite phone. She made one call and said 4 words, "Bring the equipment in." Within 48 hours, a portion of Isaac's garage had been converted into a functioning technical workstation. 3 large monitors sat on a steel work table that Eleanor's logistics team had driven down in a cargo van from Houston. There was an encrypted broadband link running through a portable satellite terminal mounted on a tripod in the lot outside. Adrian Cole, the youngest engineer on Eleanor's team, 26 years old, a master's degree from MIT, a previous internship at JPL, had been assigned to work directly with Isaac on site. He arrived on the second morning with a backpack full of gear and the carefully maintained expression of a person who had been told to keep an open mind and was working hard at it. He had read Isaac's original report on the flight down. He had read it 3 times. He thought it was technically sound. He was less certain about what it meant that the report's author was now working out of a garage with no current credentials and a residue of industrial solvent on his forearms. The first hour of working with Isaac recalibrated Adrian's expectations in a way he would describe later as a quiet realignment. Not dramatic, not a single revelation. Just a series of moments in which Isaac said things that were 3 steps ahead of where Adrian's analysis had reached, and said them not with the performance of brilliance, but with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who had been living inside the same technical problem for 6 years and had worn all the rough edges down. On the second afternoon, Isaac pointed to a secondary harmonic signature in the pressure telemetry that none of the team in Houston had identified, explained what it meant in 2 sentences, and wrote the corrective function on the back of a parts receipt from AutoZone. Adrian photographed it with his phone and sent it to the Houston team without comment. They came back 12 minutes later asking who had derived it. Adrian typed, "The mechanic." He did not elaborate, and no one asked him to. The memo Cameron had filed with the Oversight Board escalated 2 days later into a formal legal notice from Nexora's General Counsel addressed to NASA's Office of the General Counsel. The notice argued that Isaac's technical participation in the OBSIDN-7 remediation constituted a breach of the non-disclosure agreement he had signed in 2017, specifically the clauses related to disclosure of design methodology and proprietary engineering analysis derived from his time at Nexora. The argument was technically sophisticated. It did not claim that Isaac was wrong, and it did not deny the validity of the failure prediction. It argued that the remediation process was drawing on analysis that existed only because Isaac had worked at Nexora, and that allowing him to continue constituted an uncompensated use of proprietary intellectual development. It was the kind of argument that sounded unreasonable to an engineer and plausible to a lawyer who had not read the actual report. A portion of the oversight board found it worth taking seriously. Eleanor received a call from her deputy director on a Wednesday afternoon, telling her that she might need to pause Isaac's involvement while the legal question was reviewed. She said she understood, ended the call, and drove to the garage. Isaac was on the floor when she arrived, not under a vehicle this time but cross-legged in front of 3 printed telemetry reports spread in a row on the concrete, with a yellow notepad balanced on his knee. He did not look up when she came in. "The software remediation that Nexora proposed will not work," he said. "They want to adjust the valve cycling command sequence to reduce activation frequency. That reduces vibration amplitude in the short term, but it also reduces pressure regulation authority, which means the navigation correction burns will start drawing down the propellant reserve faster than the mission profile accounts for. You'll gain maybe 10 days before the propellant budget runs out and the satellite loses orbital station keeping." He looked up. "Their engineers know this. Someone approved the proposal anyway." Eleanor sat down on the stool. "The board may ask me to pull you from the project while the legal matter is reviewed." "How long would that review take?" "Probably 3 weeks minimum." Neither of them spoke for a moment. "We have 31 days, Eleanor said, which is now 28. Isaac looked at the telemetry sheets on the floor. He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up and went to his laptop. The personal one, the old one, the one he had used in Houston and carried with him when he left. He opened a file directory, scrolled to a folder dated February 2017, and opened an email draft that had never been sent. The attachment in the draft was the final version of the failure report. Not the version that had been submitted to the internal review committee, but the original, the one he had written before Cameron's team had requested he reframe the methodology section. The file's metadata recorded the date it was created, the version history, and the access log from Nexora's internal document system. Cameron Ashford's name appeared at the top of the access list. The log showed he had opened the file 4 times in the week before Isaac was terminated. Isaac forwarded the file to Eleanor without a note. Then he typed one line, "The non-disclosure agreement I signed cannot erase metadata." The emergency technical review convened at 9 in the morning on a Thursday connecting Houston, Washington, 2 contractor facilities, and a garage in Harlow, Texas over an encrypted video link. Cameron Ashford opened from Washington flanked by 2 Nexora engineers and a legal representative sitting just off camera. He presented the Nexora software remediation proposal with polished slide graphics and a timeline that showed resolution in 25 days. He framed Isaac's analysis as the work of a private individual without current certification operating outside the formal engineering review process, and he used the word unvalidated 4 times in 6 minutes. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When Cameron finished, she said, "Isaac has something to share." Cameron said, "I'd like to note for the record that any analysis from a non-credentialed source." Eleanor said, "It's already been noted, Cameron." Isaac had no slides. He had 3 pages of handwritten analysis, which Adrian had scanned and was now displaying from Houston. The first page was the resonant vibration model, complete, with the combined thermal and mechanical transfer functions integrated into a single system-level prediction. The second page was a quantitative comparison between the Nexora remediation proposal and his own, showing that the Nexora approach would extend operational life by 9 to 11 days before propellant depletion. The third page was the corrective command sequence, 17 parameters, each derived analytically, that would force the valve assembly into a sub-resonant operating mode, decoupling the mechanical vibration from the thermal cycle and halting the fatigue progression without altering the pressure regulation authority or the propellant budget. Cameron said this has not been validated by any peer review process. A voice from the Houston contingent said, "I ran the model, the numbers check out." It was a structural dynamics engineer named Grace who had been on Eleanor's team for 4 years and had not spoken until that moment. Another voice from a second contractor connection said, the 93-minute harmonic suppression in the third parameter set, I see the same result. This resolves the resonance coupling. A third voice said something quietly in the background that the audio feed did not fully capture, but the word Isaac heard was obvious. Cameron's camera feed went dark 4 seconds after the third voice spoke. The connection did not drop. He had manually disabled the video. His audio remained on for another 12 seconds, and during those 12 seconds there was the sound of a chair moving and a door closing. Then his audio dropped too. The Nexora legal representative remained on the call, said nothing for the remainder of the session, and disconnected without comment when Eleanor formally concluded the review and began the process of submitting Isaac's remediation framework for expedited technical certification. Eleanor stayed on the line after everyone else had signed off. She looked at Isaac through the small laptop camera. You know this doesn't end here, she said. Isaac looked back at the screen. I knew that 6 years ago too. What happened to the satellite happened faster than the worst-case model had predicted. On the morning of the 7th day after Eleanor had arrived in Harlow, OBSDN-7 issued 2 automated attitude correction burns within a 4-hour window, a frequency that the mission profile had never anticipated. Each burn consumed 3 times the expected propellant volume. The reserve budget, which should have lasted another 24 days at projected burn rates, had contracted to an operational window of 11 days. The revised countdown meant that the software remediation Cameron's team had proposed, which would have taken 25 days to implement and test, was now irrelevant. The only option that existed within the available window was Isaac's command sequence, and it would have to be uplinked within 72 hours to give the system time to stabilize before the next critical orbital maneuver. The oversight board convened at 2 in the morning. The metadata file Isaac had sent Eleanor had arrived in the General Counsel's office 18 hours prior. The access log showing Cameron's 4 visits to Isaac's original unredacted report, dated to the week before his termination, was not dispositive of anything in legal terms, but it was sufficient to complicate the non-disclosure claim substantially enough that the board's legal advisors recommended against pursuing it in the current operational context. Cameron's formal consulting arrangement was suspended pending review. The board authorized Isaac's participation under Eleanor's direct supervision. Nobody used the word vindication. Nobody used the word apology. They used the words operational timeline and mission continuity, which were, in this context, the same thing. Isaac came to Houston for the first time. He had not been in that city in 6 years. Eleanor drove him from the airport herself, which Adrian noted was not how senior program directors typically handled logistics for external consultants. The NASA facility at the Johnson Space Center was different from the Nexora building in the kind of way that only registered if you had spent years in both. The pace was different, the vocabulary was different. Something about the density of the work was different in a way Isaac could feel in the air. He was given a temporary badge and a workstation. He did not use the workstation. He stood at the primary command input terminal in the orbital operations room and looked at the screen that showed OBSIDN-7's current telemetry feed. The room held 37 people. Eleanor stood to his right. Adrian stood to his left, holding a printed copy of the command sequence as a redundant backup. There was no drama in the room, not the performed kind. There was the particular silence of people who understood exactly what the next few minutes represented and had no room for anything but the work. Isaac looked at the sequence. He had written the 17 parameters over the course of 7 days, adjusting them each morning as the new telemetry came in, but the fundamental derivation had been correct on the first night in the garage. He knew the numbers. He had been carrying them in his head the way a carpenter carries the dimensions of a frame, not because he needed to show anyone, but because they were simply there, part of the structure of his thinking. He entered the sequence with the deliberate precision of a person who has rehearsed nothing, because he has understood everything. 8 seconds passed. The signal traveled from Houston to a relay antenna in New Mexico up to a communications satellite in geosynchronous orbit, and across 240 miles of atmosphere to a vehicle the size of a school bus moving at 17,000 miles per hour above the Indian Ocean. The pressure gauge on the primary display, which had been anchored in the red zone for 4 days, shifted 1 color band to the left. Orange. It held. The secondary harmonic display, which Adrian had added to the monitoring configuration 2 days earlier based on Isaac's recommendation, flatlined. The oscillation that had been destroying the valve assembly 193-minute cycle at a time went quiet. The next orbital cycle passed. The pressure reading moved from orange to yellow. The cycle after that it moved to green. The third cycle ended and the green held, steady and clean, without fluctuation. Adrian clapped once, a single flat sound in the silence, and then the room followed, not in the eruption of a launch celebration but in the quieter, more considered release of people who had been holding their breath for 10 days and were only now deciding it was safe to let it go. Isaac did not turn around. He looked at the green pressure reading for a long moment, then stepped back from the terminal and walked to the hallway outside, where the fluorescent lights were slightly cooler and the sound from the operations room was muffled by a closed fire door. He stood with his back against the wall and closed his eyes. He was not celebrating and he was not processing relief. He was doing something quieter and harder, which was adjusting to the reality of being right after 6 years of being told he was not. Eleanor came through the door 30 seconds later. She did not say anything. She stood beside him in the hallway in the way that people who understand each other's silences sometimes simply occupy space together, and she waited. Isaac opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling, white acoustic tile, standard government specification, and then at the wall across from him, and then finally at Eleanor. He nodded once. She nodded back. They went inside. The formal investigation that followed was conducted not through litigation but through the audit process that NASA was required to initiate following any significant propulsion anomaly on a classified mission. The audit required the reconstruction of all technical decisions made during the design and approval phase of the Prometheus drive assembly. Every document, every approval signature, every internal review record from Nexora was subpoenaed. The audit did not produce a public finding. It produced a restricted technical report that circulated within a small number of offices, and the consequences of that report were the kind that happened quietly and permanently. Cameron Ashford resigned from his consulting arrangement with NASA 3 weeks after the audit began, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities. Nexora Aerospace was removed from the shortlist for the next major propulsion contract cycle, not through a public disqualification, not through a lawsuit, but through the standard procurement process that resulted in their proposal being evaluated and declined. In the aerospace contracting world, that outcome was understood by everyone who needed to understand it. Giselle Hartman sent Isaac an email 10 days after the audit concluded. It was 2 paragraphs long. It did not contain the words, "I'm sorry." It said that the decisions made in 2017 had not accurately reflected the quality of Isaac's technical work, and that she hoped he understood Nexora's position had been shaped by pressures that were, in retrospect, incorrectly weighted. Isaac read the email once, sitting at the workbench in the garage on a Tuesday morning, and did not reply. The formal restoration of Isaac's professional engineering certification came through NASA's Office of Technical Standards under an expedited review process. Eleanor signed the sponsorship letter. The certification arrived in the mail in a plain white envelope with no accompanying note beyond the standard documentation. Isaac set it on the workbench under a coffee mug, where it sat for 3 days before he put it in a folder in the filing cabinet his father had used for vehicle registration records. Eleanor called him the evening the certification was processed, which she knew because she had been tracking its status. "There's a position available," she said. "It's not at Nexora, and it never will be. It's a direct staff role with the Propulsion Systems Analysis Group, based in Houston. You'd be the lead analyst on next-generation drive architecture for the Lunar Surface Access Program." She paused. "It's a real offer, Isaac." Not a courtesy. He was quiet for a long time. "Let me go back to Harlow first," he said. "There are things I need to finish," Eleanor said. "Finish them and then what?" He did not answer immediately. After a moment she asked, "Are you closing the garage or handing it off?" Another pause. And then Isaac said something that Eleanor would remember later as the first time she had heard him say anything that was not either a technical assessment or a deflection of sentiment. He said, "I'll let you know." It was not a yes. But it was not the no that he would have said 6 months earlier, and Eleanor Voss had been listening to the difference between those two things her entire career. He drove back to Harlow on a Thursday afternoon, windows down, the same jazz station out of San Antonio barely audible over the road noise. The garage looked exactly as he had left it, the sign with its paint curling from the bottom edge, the parts bins in their order, the smell of oil and metal, and that specific warm concrete smell that he associated not with the work but with the place itself, with the particular quality of Texas light coming through the single south-facing window in the late afternoon. Raymond's truck was still in the corner. He had left it unfinished when Eleanor's SUVs arrived. He got his tools from the wall and slid under the frame and lay there in the quiet for a moment, listening to the garage settle in the afternoon heat before he reached for the wrench and found his place in the work. Dale Hutchins drifted to the fence line at around 4, as he sometimes did, but he stood there for a long while without saying anything, watching the 3 black Suburbans that were still parked outside. The logistics team had not yet returned to collect the equipment from inside. Dale stood at the fence and looked at the vehicles and looked at the garage and did not say the thing he usually said, and then walked back to his own lot without a word. Isaac heard all of this from under the truck. He said nothing. He had not said anything to Dale Hutchins in 6 years, and silence had always been the correct response. His phone vibrated on the concrete beside him. He picked it up and looked at the screen. "Eleanor," he answered. She confirmed the logistics team would be there tomorrow for the equipment, and then she gave him the date of the first planning meeting in Houston, and then there was a pause that he recognized as the pause before she said something she had been deciding whether to say. "You know what's strange," she said. "I looked up your address on satellite imagery when I was trying to decide whether to fly down. I looked at it 3 times before I drove out here because I couldn't reconcile someone who wrote that report with what I was seeing in the image." She paused again. "I kept thinking I had the wrong address." Isaac set the wrench down on the concrete beside him and looked up at the underside of Raymond's truck, at the frame rails, at the patched rust, at the work he had been doing and would finish before the end of the day. "My father worked in this garage," he said. "He told me once that an engine doesn't need anyone to believe in it to run." He picked up the wrench again. He heard Eleanor on the other end of the line start to say something, and then stop, and then say, quietly, that she supposed that was about right. He said he'd see her in Houston. She said she'd see him then. The call ended. The garage was quiet. The jazz station on the radio was playing something slow and unhurried from a long time ago, and outside the Texas afternoon was going gold along the tops of the mesquite trees at the edge of the lot, and Isaac Merritt, engineer, mechanic, the man they had called junk and then needed and then tried to bury again, put both hands on his work and kept going.